Hi, my name is Amber Potts. This is my case study on when ethics and policies collide for educational leadership. Go ahead and take a look at section 1 on our case summary. We have what happened at Rocket Junior High. So our case takes place at Rocket Junior High. They have a pretty diverse student body, roughly 900 students attend, and some of those students come from the rougher south side of town. One of our individuals involved is Richard Inman. He is responsible for investigating the claim from a teacher about two students who exchanged something, possibly drugs or drug related, in the hall. He is finding it difficult to file expulsion papers for David, one of the students involved, despite it being the district's policy to do so as a response to bringing a weapon to school. James is our 15-year-old student who admitted to bringing and giving the brass knuckles to David, and he was going to use them after school to take care of some business. David is our 13-year-old student. He is the one being arrested for being in possession of the brass knuckles. Section 2, legal and ethical issues. So what legal and or ethical issues are those involved faced with? So Mr. Inman, our assistant principal, is legally obligated to uphold the school district's zero tolerance policy. At first, he's refusing to follow the policy because he did not file David's expulsion paperwork. We're led to believe that he felt it wasn't ethical for David to be expelled because he is an excellent student. And this is all kind of emotionally taxing on Mr. Inman. Being responsible for this decision is he's having a hard time with it. This is all kind of resulting in his career and reputation being on the line because he has not followed district policy and he's been reminded to follow it at least one time. And so he's been informed of the consequences and that it could impact, and those consequences could impact future jobs. James, our troubled student, he brought and concealed brass knuckles to school. He did he told us he threatened David into concealing the brass knuckles. And then when David was about to take the fall for having the knuckles on him, James actually spoke up and tried to protect David from the consequences that he was about to face. So James will inevitably have another referral on his school record, possibly felony charges depending on how things go, which will affect his future job prospects, and I'm sure affect him socially and emotionally as well. Having to stay at the juvenile center and so on. David, our honor student, was threatened by James. He kept brass knuckles for him. He will now likely have a permanent record if he's charged with a felony, bringing a weapon to school. And this is going to have a social and emotional impact on him. He's going to suffer some consequences staying at the juvenile center, socially, with his peers. He kind of had the reputation of being the honor student. Then emotionally, what that impact is going to have on him, from family perspective and just from letting himself down possibly. James's mom, she is having to deal with the ramifications of her son's actions. She's going to have to deal probably with court proceedings and the financial burden associated with that. Those things aren't cheap, especially if it takes more than one, staying at the juvenile center and or multiple court hearings. Excuse me, I apologize. And then emotionally draining for a parent as well, especially considering that she's had repeated dealings with James's referrals in school. David's mom has had to she's also dealing with the ramifications of her son's actions. And again, she will likely have to handle court proceedings and financial burden associated with that as well. The emotional toll that this has on her and her family especially because we're led to believe that she was not aware of the district's policy. Um, I imagine there might be some fear for her son, since as far as we know, that he was threatened by James, so maybe fear for his safety. And then, I mean, kind of the flip side, she may not trust David as much as she once did after this incident. Does the action or situation contravene an existing law? The actions of the two boys most definitely contravene an existing law. Weapons of any kind are not prohibited at school, and that includes brass knuckles. So consequently, both boys could be facing felony charges. The assistant principal is legally obligated to uphold district policies, which do include enforcing that zero tolerance policy, but it's not necessarily illegal for him to refuse to fill out the paperwork for David's expulsion. However, that choice does come with ramifications to Mr. Inman. So he does have a decision to make, and he has been informed of what the consequences of his inaction are. So it's up to him. Was there a breach of contract? I think that if the principal does not file the expulsion paperwork for David, that it could possibly be viewed as a breach of contract, because he's just outright refusing to uphold school policy, especially with something as big as a zero tolerance policy regarding weapons at school. So again, being informed that he needs to file the paperwork out and what the consequences are if he does not file it. Were actions discriminatory or constitute harassment? I think James's verbal threat of physical violence toward David was definitely harassment, or could be viewed as harassment. And right now, I think since it currently looks like James is the only one who's being punished, being expelled, that could be perceived as harassment towards James, and possibly even discriminatory, because they could be holding his prior offenses against him, and discriminating in that way. And Mr. Inman, it could look like he's favoring David because of David's preconceived, or because of his preconceived perceptions of David, and him being an honor student, and so on. Section 3, so let's kind of nail down what actually happened. So in this case study, we are presented with an incident that took place in the hallway of Rocket Junior High, resulting in two boys being taken to the first-year assistant principal, who has encountered a legal and ethical dilemma involving weapon possession at school, but has chosen not to follow the same district protocol for both students. Section 4, a little bit more on the facts. What we do know for sure is that this took place at Rocket Junior High, which is a public secondary school, grades 9 to 12, with approximately 900 students attending. It's located in an urban area, south side of town. We know, the specific programs offered, we didn't know, but I guess we could add in there that they have honors programs, because we know that David is an honors student. The incident, students exchange took place in the hallway before 5th hour. The principal-student interaction occurred in his office. The students were taken to the detention facility after decision, or the brass knuckles were found. And we know that James was permitted to attend school through a provided alternative option. Mr. Inman is our former Southside student and the current assistant principal in his first year. Our 5th period teacher is the one who reported the suspicious activity. James is 15 years old, with a history of getting in trouble. David Ramos is 13 years old. He's an honor student, and he has never been in trouble. The SRO, school resource officers who arrested David, and he was present during all of the questioning. James's mother, her reaction was not at all surprised with James's behavior. In fact, she was going to let him sit in the juvenile center for a little while and hope that he learned his lesson. David's mother was very worried and concerned about what had occurred. And after getting off the phone with the assistant principal, she immediately came down to the school to have a face-to-face conversation. The director of secondary education, he simply wants policy to be followed and has reminded Mr. Inman of that. More on the facts, kind of looking between the lines here, what we don't actually know, what's not clear. We know that Richard Inman, the assistant principal, we don't really know, did he notify the school principal of what was happening, or other administrators, or even a counselor, considering that there was a student threat made? And if he did, what was their take on the situation? How did they respond, or what did they suggest? James, do we really know if he was the one that brought the brass knuckles to school, and why he brought them? Is he being truthful about threatening David? Was that how it all went down? David, do we know why he didn't report the brass knuckles after he was given them? Mr. Inman believes that he's innocent, but is he really? I mean, if he was given the brass knuckles, even if he was threatened, why didn't he immediately report the threat and or having been given the brass knuckles? More on the incident, James didn't actually have the weapon on his person, so is he likely to be charged with felony charges, or will there be some other charges pressed? What are the long-term outcomes for David if Mr. Inman does not file the paperwork? Will the secondary education director file it in that case? In which case, David's not really getting out of an expulsion. What are the long-term outcomes for Mr. Inman in the case of whether he doesn't file the paperwork? Is he to lose his job or just get reprimanded? So kind of those questions up in the air. Information review. So how can the information be prioritized? Could the conflict, the situation, or the decision be damaging to stakeholders or to the community? I think the decision could send mixed messages to students, parents, and community about how conflicts are dealt with. James is expelled, David was initially not, so there's inconsistent consequences there. What individuals and groups have an important stake in the outcome? Mr. Inman's job is in jeopardy. He has an official reprimand, or he could have an official reprimand in his personnel file if he does not file the expulsion paperwork following the zero tolerance policy. David, this could mean he might not reach his goals. If he's bullied, that could affect him on a personal level. That could impact his future plans negatively, this experience. James can see his actions impact others. This might cause him to improve his behavior and attitude and demeanor. I mean, he did kind of stand up and say, hey, it was me, when David was about to take the fall for the situation. So this might be a stepping stone for him. Have all relevant stakeholders been consulted? I don't think so. There's no mention of the principal being contacted and if he had any involvement in the situation. And I think that that's a big missing piece for me in this case study. Given that the students are being charged with a felony offense and facing expulsion, I think the principal should have been part of that decision, or at least aware of what was going on. If no other reason, then there was a weapon brought to school. Can I learn more about the situation? With this being a felony offense and possible bullying situation, I think we need to know where student witnesses questioned. I mean, this happened in the hallway during passing, so I feel like people could have witnessed this. And nowadays there are cameras in school hallways, so were they reviewed to see the exchange, to see what witnesses could have possibly seen something happen, really just to get more information. Do I know enough to make a decision? I think more evidence is needed to ensure the decision and consequences are appropriate and policy is followed. Do we really know if David is innocent? And what evidence do I have to support that? Section 6, we'll take a look at the options and consequences. So what could I do in this situation? I think first option, taking no action. So given the magnitude of the offense and the inexperience of a new associate principal, the principal's assistant could be solicited and he or she handle the situation. That takes the pressure off the new leader who is struggling with what to do. The second option, I think, is the most liberal, or the most liberal option, is to just ignore instinct and follow board policy. So file the expulsion paperwork on both students and proceed from there. I think other options that exist go with your gut feeling, not file the expulsion paperwork. I think another option could be to contest the board's policy and try to get it changed or discuss the situation with the director of secondary education to gain more guidance. But I think overall, the nature of this incident and the potential charges the boys face are very serious. Bringing a weapon to school and or holding and hiding a weapon for someone at school should be dealt with carefully, cautiously, and upholding ethics and legalities while setting aside personal bias. Section 7 will evaluate these options. So what are the pros and cons of the options I have presented? So option 1, so again, given the magnitude of the offense and the inexperience of the new associate principal, the principal's assistants should be solicited and he or she handle the situation. I think this takes some of the pros, takes the pressure off the new leader who's struggling with what to do. It allows a veteran individual to use prior experience to deal with the situation. And it also demonstrates ethical behavior in personal conduct and relationships. Being able to say this is above me, or I have too big of a personal bias in this situation. I think that's an important ethical or moral decision to come to and be able to acknowledge and seek out the help necessary from there. One of the negatives I could see, this could look like you're deflecting difficult decisions, so you don't want to have to make them, or you don't want to have to be the bad guy, so you're deflecting that. With option 2, the most liberal action, so just ignoring your instinct, following policy, and filing the papers. I think that demonstrates some pros that you understand district policy and you're not afraid to be compliant with the policy, and that it shows that you're able to remain unbiased in administering consequences to students. A negative here, that could mean that an innocent student is charged with a felony, which would jeopardize that student's future. Other options, going with your gut feeling, not filing the expulsion paperwork. So a couple pros there could be that others will see how much you value students and your need to do what's best for them, or that you're willing to do what's best for them. And it could show willingness to put others first. Some negatives, I think, the official reprimand on your professional record, or losing your job, obviously. And then, conversely, while it might show willingness to put others first or that you value students, it also could, the negative side, show student inequality or favoritism. The other option, contest the board policy, so look for a change, or discuss the situation with the director of secondary education. I think get others thinking about whether the policy is appropriate. That's a pro. Another pro could be gaining a deeper understanding on the policy. That could shed some insight, possibly even changing your feelings on the matter. Some negatives, not likely to affect David's situation if you went that route. So it's likely to take more time than David's situation has. and the district may not be willing to consider. Section 8, best options. So what is the best option? So when considering the best plan of action for the situation that Mr. Inman faces, as well as the provided information, I believe that the best course of action is that I presented was option 1. In option 1, I thought that given the magnitude of the offense and the inexperience of the new associate principal, that the principal's assistance should be solicited and he or she handle the situation. I think involving and observing how the principal handles this situation is a valuable experience. Through this could highlight inexperience and question authority. Or though this, sorry, that this ensures that the situation is dealt with ethically and legally. This option involves and considers all stakeholders. Mr. Inman gains the experience and the pressure is taken off of him. James is held accountable for his actions and sees firsthand, again, how those actions can impact somebody else. And then David learns that there are consequences for inaction. He could have, again, turned the brass knuckles into the teacher, administration, or a counselor. He could have reported the incident immediately after it happened. Section 9, implementation. So what does the implementation of my decision look like? So choosing a path, I chose to involve the principal. I think by bringing the principal into the situation by presenting the facts and identify confusion on how to proceed, that I need help. And I think that, you know, the inexperience of a new assistant principal or associate principal, that you need that crutch, that principal to guide you on those difficult decisions or difficult consequences. Think about what may happen. I would gain experience and alleviate stress of that situation. The principal would ultimately handle the final decisions and consequences. I would be there observing and learning. The principal, however, could think less of my capabilities, but could also think highly of my ability to recognize my inexperience or that I'm in over my head on that situation. Identify who needs to know. I think the principal and possibly the SRO both need to know. Obviously, principal, because that's the person who's going to be making the decisions. I'm just going to be observing and learning. And the SRO needs to know that the principal is now handling the situation. If this plan to seek the assistance of the principal does not work, what's my plan B? I think my plan B is to follow district policy and file the expulsion paperwork for both students. Explain the policy to everybody involved, both students, their parents. I would fill in the principal, fill out the paperwork, and then submit it. I think when it comes down to it, both students did something incorrect at school involving a weapon, and they both need to be held accountable for that. When considering the consequences for student behavior is not always easy, but in order to demonstrate the capacity to evaluate ethical dimensions of issues, analyze decisions in terms of established frameworks, or communicate about and advocate for ethical and legal decisions, I would choose to involve and get guidance from the principal who would enforce the district's zero tolerance policy. And at least have guidance for me on that, since I'm, as an inexperienced principal, struggling with that. And that would be a valuable experience and teaching moment for me as a new administrator. Section 10 and the NELP standards, just standard 2 on ethics and professional norms. Candidates who successfully complete a building level educational leadership preparation program understand and demonstrate the capacity to promote the current and future success as and well-being of each student and adult by applying the knowledge, skills, and commitments necessary to understand and demonstrate the capacity to advocate for ethical decisions and cultivate and enact professional norms. Thanks again for listening and viewing my presentation. Hope you have a great evening. Thanks.